My husband's village mother placed a curse on me for refusing to bow. The morning Adaeze found the dead bird on her doorstep, she did not scream. She stood very still, the way her grandmother once told her to stand when a snake crosses your path, not frozen from fear, but frozen from calculation. The bird's neck was twisted backward in a way no fall could explain, and its small black eyes were open, fixed on her bedroom window, as though someone had positioned it there on purpose. She would later remember that morning as the moment the war stopped being silent. But to understand how a woman ends up staring at a dead bird outside her own matrimonial room, you have to go back. Not to her wedding day, not to her childhood, because nothing about this story is that simple, but to a single afternoon 8 months earlier, in a compound thick with red dust and unspoken rules, where Adaeze made a mistake she did not know she was making. She had bowed her head, she had greeted properly, she had brought kola nut wrapped in a clean white cloth, exactly as her husband Ikenna had instructed her. What she had not done, what she did not even realize was required, was bend her knees fully to the ground before Mama Ijoma, her husband's mother, in the manner reserved for the village's living matriarchs. She greeted me standing, Mama Ijoma would say later to anyone who asked, her voice flat, almost amused, the way people speak about an insult so large it has become entertainment. Ikenna had laughed it off that night, holding his new wife close in the dim light of his old room, the one his mother still kept untouched, his school certificates yellowing on the wall. She is old-fashioned, he told Adaeze, kissing her forehead. Give her time, she will love you. He was wrong. And somewhere in his own chest, a place he refused to visit, Ikenna already knew he was wrong. If you are someone who appreciates a story that doesn't rush to comfort you, that lets the dread build properly, go ahead and tap that subscribe button, because where this one is going, you want to be here for every twist. Adaeze was not a foolish woman. She was 31, a pharmacist in Enugu with her own small flat before marriage, the kind of woman who read contracts before signing them, and who had in fact almost not married Ikenna at all. There had been a hesitation, 8 months before the wedding, that she never spoke about to anyone, not even to her closest friend Nkichi. A hesitation involving a phone number she found saved under a strange name in Ikenna's phone, a number she dialed once, late at night, and let ring without speaking, when a woman's voice answered, "Ikenna, my love, you've changed your number again?" She had told herself it was an old contact, an ex-girlfriend who hadn't updated her save. She buried the moment women are taught to bury small earthquakes, hoping they don't return as something bigger. She did not know, not yet, that this buried earthquake and the curse her mother-in-law would later threaten her with were not two separate stories. They were the same root, growing in two directions. Mama Ijoma's hostility deepened with a method that felt almost ceremonial. First came the comments, delivered with the practiced softness of a woman who had spent 40 years learning to wound people while smiling. In my time, a wife rises before her husband, not after. Then came the comparisons to Chiamaka, Ikenna's cousin's wife, who apparently swept the entire compound by 5 a.m. and never raised her voice. Then came the visits, not to Adaeze, but around her, as though she were furniture being discussed in her presence. And then, 3 months into the marriage, Mama Ijoma began visiting Pa Nwanke, the herbalist who lived at the edge of the village, near the old stream that the young people had been warned since childhood never to swim in after dusk. Nobody told Adaeze this directly. She learned it the way village wives learn everything, sideways, through a careless comment from her husband's younger sister Ogechi, who mentioned it while complaining about being sent to carry yam and a black hen to Mama's special place every new moon. Special place for what? Adaeze asked, stirring stew she suddenly didn't want to eat anymore. Ogechi shrugged, the shrug of a girl too young to understand the weight of what she was saying. She has gone there since before you came, Seth. Since Auntie... She stopped herself, bit her lip, and changed the subject so fast that Adaeze immediately knew a name had almost slipped out, a name she was not supposed to hear. This is how secrets work in compounds like this.
They don't announce themselves. They leak, drop by drop, through people too young or too careless to know they are leaking. Adaeze did not sleep well that night. She lay beside Ikenna, who slept the untroubled sleep of a man who believed his two women, his wife and his mother, would eventually resolve their differences without him ever needing to choose a side. He did not know, or pretended not to know, what choosing required of him. Men like Ikenna built their peace on other people's silence. The strange occurrences began slowly enough that Adaeze almost convinced herself she was imagining patterns where none existed. A broken mirror in her bedroom, though she had not dropped it. Red palm oil smeared in a strange cross pattern on her doorstep, gone by the time she called Ikenna to see it. A particular itch on the sole of her left foot that no cream could calm, that her own mother, when she finally called her in Enugu, voice shaking, told her, gravely, was not an ordinary itch. It was also the afternoon at the village market, weeks before the bird appeared, when Adaeze went to buy crayfish and overheard two women near the tomato stalls discussing her without realizing she stood close enough to hear every word. "That is the one woman whispered, not unkindly, more like someone repeating gossip she herself didn't fully believe. The other woman clicked her tongue and replied that restless spirits run in families, that you could trace such things back to generations if you knew where to look. And Adaeze, standing frozen between the tomato baskets, had felt for the first time that her mother-in-law's campaign against her had already spread beyond the compound into the mouths of strangers who had never even met her. She walked home that day, rehearsing confrontations she never had the courage to deliver, replaying the women's words, wondering exactly what Mama Ijoma meant by restless, wondering, though she did not have the full picture to understand why the word would later feel so prophetic, whether her mother-in-law somehow already suspected something about her bloodline long before any document confirmed it. "You should have refused to bow," her mother said, and Adaeze felt something cold settle in her stomach because her mother, of all people, was not a superstitious woman. Her mother had a degree in microbiology. If her mother was frightened, then something real was happening, whether or not it wore the name of magic.
It was around this time, and this is where the story stops being simple, that Adaeze discovered the second secret. Not Mama Ijoma's visits to the herbalist, which she had already half confirmed. This was different. This one came wrapped inside an old photo album she was not meant to find, tucked beneath folded Ankara in a trunk Mama Ijoma had asked her to dust during spring cleaning. In the album, beneath a photograph of much younger Ikenna in secondary school uniform, was a second photograph, a baby, swaddled in white, held by a young woman who was clearly not Mama Ijoma. The handwriting beneath it, faded but legible, said only Neka and her daughter. God forgive us. Adaeze stared at that photograph longer than she should have, her heart performing the slow, sickening calculations that women perform when they sense a door about to open onto something they cannot close again. Neka. The name on the phone months before her wedding had also been Neka. If you've ever felt your stomach drop at finding something you weren't supposed to find, you already understand exactly where Adaeze's mind went next. Stay with me because this is where everything starts to bend. She did not confront Ikenna immediately. This was, perhaps, her first true display of the discipline her mother-in-law claimed she lacked, because what Adaeze did instead was wait, watch, and quietly begin asking careful questions disguised as casual curiosity. She asked Ogechi about Auntie Neka, as though she already knew the name well, and Ogechi, eager and unsuspecting, filled in details Adaeze hadn't even asked for. Neka had been Mama Ijoma's husband's younger relative, not blood, but close enough in the way villages stretch family lines, who had lived with them for 2 years when Ikenna was a teenager. She had left suddenly, pregnant, unmarried, disgraced. The family handled it the way such families always handled it, quietly, with money changing hands, with the girl sent to a relative's house in another state, with her name slowly erased from conversation until even mentioning her felt like trespassing. "Mama doesn't like when we talk about her," Ogechi said. suddenly nervous, as though remembering too late that she shouldn't have said this much. She says Nneka brought shame and confusion into this house. Confusion. The word stuck to Adaeze's mind like a burr. What kind of confusion does an unmarried pregnant relative bring into a house beyond the ordinary shame? Unless the confusion wasn't about whose child it was, but who the father was. She thought of Ikenna at the time of Nneka's disgrace, a teenager already, old enough. She thought of the photograph of the baby, the apology scrawled beneath it, God forgive us. Us, plural. This is the kind of thought that once it enters a woman's mind cannot simply be asked to leave. By the time Adaeze walked up the courage to raise the subject with Ikenna, carefully, sideways, the way she had learned to extract truth in this household, 3 more months had passed, and the curse talk had grown louder, more public, more dangerous. Mama Ijeoma had begun saying things outside the compound walls, to other women at the market, things that traveled back to Adaeze in fragments carried by well-meaning neighbors. That girl will not last in this family. Some things cannot be undone once a curse finds its target. She thinks her education will save her from what is coming. Adaeze had laughed these off in front of others, performing the unbothered confidence expected of a modern woman who didn't believe in such things. But at night, alone with her fears, she had begun keeping a private record. Dates, incidents, small details. Not because she believed in curses exactly, but because some part of her, the pharmacist part, the part trained to notice patterns, understood that something deliberate was happening to her, whether spiritual or simply cruel. The night she finally asked Ikenna about Nneka, the air in their room changed instantly, like pressure dropping before a storm. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked, too sharply, too fast. "Does it matter? I'm asking you, who is she to you?" Ikenna sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, his back to her, his shoulders carrying a weight Adaeze had never seen on him before. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all his usual confidence. "She is not my mother's relative the way everyone says," he said. "She is my mother's husband's daughter, my father's daughter, from before he married my mother." Adaeze felt the flow of her understanding shift, but not yet collapse. "Your sister?" "Half-sister, yes." "Then why all the shame? Why send her away pregnant like a criminal, if she's family?" Ikenna was quiet again, and in that silence, Adaeze heard the sound of a much bigger secret circling closer, the way you hear thunder before you see lightning. "Because the child she carried," Ikenna said, finally, barely above a whisper, "was not a stranger's child. Some people said, it was my father's child." The room went silent in a way that felt physical, like the air itself had been cooled out of it. Adaeze sat with this for a long moment before the second, more devastating question rose in her throat, the question she could not stop herself from asking, even though some instinct told her the answer would change everything. "Ikenna, does your mother know this? Is that why she hates Nneka's name so much? Not because of shame, but because her own husband—" "She knows," Ikenna said. "She has always known. That's why she sent Nneka's child away the moment it was born. That's why no one in this family is permitted to ask where that child is now. If you think you figured out where this is going, I promise you, you haven't. Keep going, because the real twist hasn't even shown its face. And if stories like this keep you holding your breath, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming." The revelation about Nneka explained Mama Ijeoma's coldness towards outsiders, her obsessive control over the household, her terror of any woman who might bring confusion into her domain again. But it did not fully, explain why she had turned so violently against Adaeze specifically, a woman who had done nothing more than fail to bend her knee on one single afternoon. That answer arrived 3 weeks later, delivered not by Ogechi's careless mouth, but by Mama Ijeoma herself in a confrontation that began as an ordinary afternoon and ended with Adaeze understanding that she had walked into this marriage carrying a secret she didn't even know was hers.
It's tattered with the dead bird. The morning Adaeze found it on her doorstep
twisted and staring, she had finally had enough of silent endurance. She picked it up with a plastic bag, walked across the compound, and placed it directly on the small wooden stool where Mama Ijeoma sat every morning to grind pepper. "If you have something to say to me," Adaeze said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "say it with your mouth. Stop sending dead things to my doorstep like a coward." The compound went still. Ogechi, washing plates nearby, froze mid-motion. Even the hens seemed to quiet down, as though sensing that something irreversible was about to happen. Mama Ijeoma looked at the bird, then at Adaeze, and for the first time since their meeting, something other than contempt moved across her face, something that looked disturbingly like recognition. "You have her spirit," Mama Ijeoma said quietly. "I should have known the moment I saw your eyes." "Whose spirit?" "Nneka's." The name landed in the courtyard like a stone dropped into still water. "You stand the way she stood. You speak the way she spoke, like the ground owes you something. I told my son not to marry a woman with that kind of fire, but he never listened. He never listened to me about her either." Adaeze felt something twist in her chest, dread mixing dangerously with confusion. "I don't understand. What does Nneka have to do with me?" What Mama Ijeoma said next was delivered with the casual cruelty of a woman who had carried a piece of devastating knowledge for so long that it no longer felt heavy to her, only convenient, a weapon finally worth using. "You really don't know," she said, almost laughing, almost pitying. "Your mother never told you where you came from before she married your father?" The question hung in the air, suffocating. "My mother is my mother," Adaeze said, but her voice had lost its earlier steadiness. "Your mother raised you," Mama Ijeoma corrected. "That is different from where you came from. Ask her. Ask her properly, not the polite questions you've been asking. Who really gave birth to you in 1995 and where that woman went afterward? Ask her why a woman from this very village suddenly appeared in Enugu with a baby nobody had seen her pregnant with." Before she could bring herself to call her mother, Adaeze did something she would later struggle to explain even to herself. She returned to the trunk where she had first found the photograph, and beneath the same folded Ankara, beneath a layer of old newspaper lining the trunk's base, she found a second envelope, brittle with age, addressed in handwriting she recognized instantly as her own mother's, not Mama Ijeoma's, her mother's from Enugu. The discovery alone told her that two women who claimed to be strangers to each other had once, somehow, exchanged letters they never spoke of again. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single page, dated 11 months before Adaeze's birth, written in the careful, formal English of someone unused to writing such things. It promised that the child would be raised far from the village, that no one in Enugu would ever trace her back to this household, and that this silence would be kept in exchange for a silence owed in return. It was signed simply Florence, her mother's name. Adaeze sat on the floor of that storage room for nearly an hour, the letter trembling in her hands, piecing together a timeline that no longer required her mother's confession to be believed, only confirmed. Mama Ijeoma had known. Of course she had known. She likely had arranged the entire quiet transaction, sending her husband's disgraced daughter's child away to a family far enough from the village that no one would connect the threads ever. She had not married into ignorance of Adaeze's origins. She had orchestrated the erasure of them herself decades ago, and then watched her own son walk back into the very story she thought she had buried for good. This realization changed everything Adaeze thought she understood about the curses, the herbalist visits, and the dead bird on her doorstep. They were not simply cruelty aimed at a disrespectful daughter-in-law. They were panic. The panic of a woman watching a secret she personally engineered begin to unravel itself thread by thread in front of her, with no way to stop it without confessing her own hand in creating it. It would take Adaeze 3 more sleepless days,
2 unanswered calls, and 1 tearful confrontation in her mother's Enugu sitting room to arrive at the fuller truth that the universe, or fate, or whatever force writes these kinds of cruelly perfect coincidences, had been arranging long before she ever met Ikana. Her mother, when finally cornered, did not deny it. She simply wept, the kind of weeping that comes from carrying something too long, and told Adaeze a story she had buried for 31 years. That Adaeze was not born to her, but adopted as an infant from a young, disgraced relative who had been sent away from her village pregnant, who had given birth quietly in a borrowed room in Enugu, and who had handed her baby to a childless cousin before disappearing into a marriage in another state, never to speak of the child again. The young relative's name was Neka. Take a breath, because I know that landed hard, and if this story is keeping you on edge the way it's supposed to, this is exactly the moment to hit subscribe, because the consequences of this revelation are about to tear through everyone in this compound. The full weight of what this meant settled over Adaeze slowly, in waves that kept arriving long after she thought she'd absorbed the worst of it. If Neka was her biological mother, and if Neka's child had been fathered by Ikana's own father, then Ikana was not simply her husband, he was, by blood, her half-brother. She did not tell him immediately. She could not. She sat with this knowledge alone for 2 days, examining it from every angle, hoping for an error in the math, a misunderstanding in the dates, anything that might dissolve the horror sitting in her stomach like swallowed stone. But the dates lined up too precisely. The disgrace, the disappearance, the timing of her own birth recorded in documents her mother finally produced with shaking hands, all of it confirmed what Mama Ijeoma clearly knew, or at least suspected strongly enough to weaponize the very first time she looked into Adaeze's eyes and saw a ghost staring back. This, then, was the true engine behind months of curses, herbalist visits, and quiet cruelty. Mama Ijeoma had not been punishing Adaeze merely for failing to bow. She had been trying, through every superstitious and cruel method available to her, to drive away a woman she suspected, long before anyone had proof, might be carrying her husband's shameful secret back into her household in the most devastating way imaginable, as her own son's wife. When Adaeze finally confronted her mother-in-law with the documents, the dates, the unbearable arithmetic of it all, Mama Ijeoma's reaction was not triumph as Adaeze had expected, but a terrible brittle grief that cracked open decades of composure.
"You think I wanted to know this?" the older woman said, sinking onto her stool as though her legs had finally given up the performance of strength. "You think I enjoyed watching my son's face when he looks at you with love, knowing what blood might run beneath it? I sent Neka away to protect this family from one disgrace. I never imagined disgrace would return wearing a wedding ring." "Then why didn't you just tell us?" Adaeze's voice cracked, 31 years of unknown grief finally finding an exit. "Why curses? Why dead birds and palm oil on my doorstep instead of simply telling your son the truth?" "Because truth like this does not stay contained," Mama Ijeoma said. "It explodes. It destroys everyone it touches. I thought if I frightened you enough, you would leave on your own, and Ikena would never have to know why. I was trying to break the marriage without breaking my son." It was, Adaeze realized, with a bitterness that tasted like betrayal and pity at once, the closest thing to protection this brutal woman knew how to offer. The climax came on a humid evening when Ikena returned from work to find his wife and his mother sitting together in unbearable silence, documents spread across the small table between them like evidence at a trial neither of them wanted to attend. He read the papers slowly, his hands trembling, his face moving through disbelief, denial, and finally a devastation that aged him 10 years in the space of 10 minutes. "This cannot be true," he kept repeating, though the dates in front of him offered no mercy, no alternative interpretation. "Mama, tell me this is not true." Mama Ijeoma, for the first time in the entire story, did not defend herself, did not deflect, did not perform certainty. She simply looked at her son and said, "I am sorry." 2 words that seemed entirely insufficient for the weight of 31 years of silence now collapsing on all 3 of them at once. The confrontation that followed was not the dramatic shouting match the compound's gossiping neighbors might have hoped to overhear. it was quieter than that, and somehow more devastating. Ikenna sitting motionless at the table, while his wife, who might also be his sister, wept silently across from him, and his mother, the woman who had tried in her own twisted way to prevent exactly this outcome, sat between them like a monument to every secret that had finally run out of room to hide. At one point, Ikenna arose and walked to the window, his back to both women, and asked the question that seemed to matter most to him in that moment, more than the blood ties, more than the betrayal. Did you ever love me knowing this, or did you only find out after? Adaeze answered honestly, her voice raw, that she had loved him the way any wife loves a husband she chose freely, without any knowledge of the poison hidden beneath their union, and that the love itself had not been a lie even if the foundation beneath it had been rotten from the start. It was a small mercy, perhaps, the only one either of them could offer the other in that unbearable hour, but Ikenna received it the way a drowning man receives a single breath, gratefully, even knowing it would not be enough to save him. There was no clean resolution to offer because some truths do not resolve, they simply have to be lived with. Adaeze and Ikenna's marriage could not continue as it had been. The law and the weight of blood made that impossible. Whatever love still lingered between them, but neither could they simply walk away from each other as strangers, not after everything they had built, not after a child neither of them yet knew Adaeze was carrying, a child whose existence would complicate every decision ahead of them in the ways the family was only beginning to comprehend. In the months that followed, the marriage was quietly dissolved, not through scandal or public shame, but through a painful private separation that the family agreed to keep contained, the same way Mama Ijoma had once tried to contain Nneka's disgrace, except this time the secrecy was meant to protect a child not yet born rather than punish a woman already gone. Ogechi, who had unknowingly leaked the first threads of this story through careless youthful chatter, carried her own quiet guilt about the role she had played. She confided once to Adaeze in the final week before Adaeze packed her belongings out of the compound for good, that she had always sensed something unspoken pressing down on the household, something heavier than ordinary family tension, long before she understood any of its shape. I used to think it was just Mama being strict, Ogechi admitted, eyes lowered. I did not know I was carrying pieces of a story nobody had given me permission to tell. Adaeze forgave her easily. Ogechi had been a messenger, not an architect, and there was no use punishing the messenger for a fire she had not lit. Adaeze eventually found Nneka, now an older woman living quietly in Port Harcourt, remarried with 2 other children who knew nothing of the daughter she had given away decades earlier. Her reunion was awkward, careful, weighted with 31 years of absence that no single conversation could repair. Nneka spoke haltingly about the year she was sent away, about the shame that had followed her like a shadow into a new town, a new name for herself in the eyes of strangers, a new life built entirely on the unspoken agreement that her past would never surface again. She wept. Adaeze did not in front of her, though she cried plenty once she was alone in her car afterwards, grieving a mother she had just met and a husband she had just lost, in the same unbearable season of her life. Mama Ijoma, in the end, got something resembling what she always claimed to want, a household free of the woman who would not bow. But she did not get peace. She got a son who barely spoke to her now, who understood that her cruelty, however twisted its intentions, had cost him a marriage he might have otherwise saved if she had simply told the truth years earlier, instead of reaching for curses and herbalists and dead birds left on doorsteps like warnings written in a language only fear could read. Visitors to the compound noticed she had stopped visiting Pangwanku altogether after that final confrontation, as though whatever power she once believed those monthly rituals held dissolved the moment her own buried truth was dragged into daylight. Some said it was guilt, others said a woman who has already lost everything has nothing left worth cursing for. As for the curse itself, whether it was ever real, whether Pangwanku's monthly rituals carried any actual power, or whether the true curse had simply been decades of silence finally collecting its debt, the story never offers a clean answer, because life rarely does. What is certain is this: Adaeze survived it, scarred but standing, raising her child alone in Enugu, teaching her daughter early that some inheritances are not about money or land, but about the secrets a family chooses to bury, and the terrible cost of refusing even once to let them stay buried.
If this story moved you, sat with you, made you question what you would have done in Adaeze's place, let me know down in the comments. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because there are more stories like this one waiting. Stories where nothing is ever as simple as it first appears, and where the truth, once it starts walking towards you, never agrees to turn back.